Why does the United States Navy, the most powerful navy on Earth, not have big, beautiful battleships anymore? Calls to return to the days of giant ships with giant guns have been consistent through the decades since the last battleship, the USS Missouri, was laid down in 1941. Most recently, President Trump has indicated he wants the Navy to build new battleships to be part of the Golden Fleet, as he calls it. Battleships defined naval power for half a century. They helped win 2 world wars. They shelled beaches from Normandy to Okinawa, and they became floating symbols of American naval and industrial dominance. But even as every other part of the fleet has been reinvented to stay relevant over the decades, the Navy never resurrected the capital ship that once defined sea power. Welcome back to Task and Purpose. I'm Kyle, and today we are going to talk about why battleships faded into history, discuss the past attempts to bring them back and why those failed, and then finally get into what a modern battleship might look like and why that is likely to fail too. But before we get to that, a quick word from today's sponsor, Odoo. If you're in manufacturing, you already know the challenges. Orders stack up, delays start sneaking in, all your tools that are supposed to make your life easier start to do the opposite. Odoo fixes that. Odoo gives you one dashboard where you can manage assembly stations, check load times, track work orders, keep up with shipments. Everything that happens on your floor, you can see. Their barcode app makes it easy to scan and log components in real time right from the production line. So you spend less time fixing data errors and more time getting orders out the door. Need to check a worksheet or bill of materials? It's all right there, right in the dashboard, connected and synced. With Odoo, you have everything covered from planning to production with smooth and simple software. Start with your first app for free at odoo.com. That's ODOO.com. You'll be happy you did, and we'd like to thank Odoo for sponsoring today's episode. I do not deliver this news with any sort of glee. I personally think battleships are awesome, but we kind of got to operate in reality, so let's get started. Before we can really get into it, we have to define what a battleship even is. Many people still call destroyers, or really any large Navy ship, battleships, much like how people will call a Bradley a tank, and not just to get the armabubbas worked up. Fun fact, if you call a Bradley a cute tank, you get a pass. A battleship wasn't just a large ship with big guns. It was a specific type of capital ship built around a single mission: to fight and survive against other capital ships in a line of battle engagement. Everything about the design flowed from that requirement. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 classified any warship with guns over 8 inches and displacing more than 10,000 tons as a capital ship, but battleships were the only ones built with the armor and firepower required to trade blows with peer opponents. Battleships carried heavy main batteries, usually 12 to 16 inch rifled guns, because those were the only weapons capable of penetrating the thick armor of another battleship at long range. Their defining feature, besides the massive guns, was the armored citadel, a box of 12 to 18 inches of hardened steel protecting magazines and machinery. That survivability requirement is what separated battleships from battle cruisers, which carried similar guns, but they sacrificed armor for speed. The other essential ingredient was displacement, because only very large hulls could carry both heavy guns and heavy armor. Pre-World War I battleships were around 15,000 tons, which was quite large for the day, but World War II giants like Iowa or the Japanese Yamato ranged from 45,000 tons to more than 70,000. Their size and protection made them the doctrinal centerpiece of early 20th century fleets. They were the supreme ships on the high seas, but that supremacy would be short-lived. Battleships became central to great power strategy because, for nearly half a century, they were the only ships capable of destroying an enemy fleet in a single engagement. After HMS Dreadnought entered service in 1906 and rendered virtually every other ship obsolete overnight, naval power effectively became a global arms race measured in big guns and heavily armored ships. These vessels were the backbone of deterrence. A nation's battleship fleet didn't just defend its coastline, it protected its maritime trade, colonial colonial possessions, and political influence. That logic shaped World War I, even though the massive fleet battle everyone expected never really happened. The German High Seas Fleet and the British Grand Fleet both understood that losing their battleships likely meant losing the war. As a result, fleets spent most of the conflict maneuvering for advantage, blockading commerce, and trying to avoid catastrophic losses. The one major clash, Jutland in 1916, ended inconclusively with both sides claiming victory, but it proved the core idea that the side with more battleships, in this case Great Britain, controlled the North Sea and therefore the flow of food, trade, and war materiel. Even without frequent combat, battleships influenced strategy by their very existence, forcing Germany into a costly naval buildup and allowing Britain to maintain a war-winning blockade. In World War I, battleships mattered because they were the currency of naval power, and every major decision at sea revolved around protecting or challenging them. Because of this, it's easy to assume that battleships reigned supreme through World War II, but the decline started much earlier. After World War I, the world's major powers signed the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which capped the number and size of battleships across the world. On the surface, this looks like normal arms control, but the context matters. Admirals and strategists were already questioning whether more armor and bigger guns were the future, or whether submarines and aircraft represented a fundamental shift in naval combat. By the 1930s, that shift was becoming clear. Naval aviation advocates inside the US Navy, people like Rear Admiral William Moffett, were already describing aircraft carriers as the future of sea power. Pilots and naval architects were arguing that naval aircraft were gaining range, accuracy, and survivability far faster than battleship guns. The naval treaties didn't kill battleships, but they froze innovation for over a decade and indirectly boosted investment into carriers. While battleships were limited to 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns, aircraft carriers were not. So the Navy had to bet on the platform with the most room for growth, and that was naval aviation. If they had any doubts about carriers in the age of battleships, what transpired on December 7, 1941 removed them. The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor didn't instantly make battleships irrelevant, but it did prove something American analysts had suspected. Aircraft could sink these capital ships long before they ever came into gun range of the carriers that delivered them. The US Navy's own damage reports from Pearl Harbor made it brutally clear how vulnerable these ships were to air attack. The lesson the Navy learned was simple. If aircraft could kill battleships at anchor, they could kill them at sea and relatively easily by dropping bombs through thinly armored decks. Carriers had arrived in a big way and there was just no turning back. Everything that happened after 1941 just drove that point home even more. Every single decisive naval battle in the Pacific War, Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, was fought and won by aircraft. The longest range hit ever recorded by a battleship gun was about 26 miles. By 1944, US carrier aircraft could strike from 200 miles away. Of Japanese naval ships sunk during the war, about 70% were sent to the depths by aircraft, both carrier and land-based. Only about 5 to 10% were sunk by surface gunfire, which included battleships, but also smaller vessels. That's pretty much the whole story. So battleships shifted into supporting roles like night engagements, anti-aircraft escort, and shore bombardment. They performed those roles well, but they were no longer shaping battles. As early as 1945, Admiral Ernest King wrote in his post-war reports that carriers, not battleships, were the new centerpiece of naval strategy. Even the Iowa class, the most advanced battleships ever built, were practically relics the day they were commissioned. Their guns were truly masterpieces of engineering, capable of firing a 2,700-pound shell nearly 24 miles. But naval warfare had already moved much further than 24 miles. The writing was on the wall, and the Cold War was the final nail in the giant battleship coffin. After the United States dropped atom bombs on Japan to end the war, a new age dawned, and with it, a new threat environment dominated by nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, and long-range bombers. A battleship couldn't outrun a Tu-22M backfire carrying Cage-22 anti-ship missiles. It couldn't dive beneath the waves to evade detection, and no amount of armor could save it from a nuclear torpedo, because yes, those were a thing. Even subsonic cruise missiles presented a significant threat. The US Navy's post-war fleet reports and congressional hearings show the service wrestling with something uncomfortable. Battleships were impressive, they were useful for gunfire support, and they were beloved symbols. But they were not survivable or cost-effective in a world shaped by missile technology. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Navy experimented with turning battleships into modern platforms. Nuclear propulsion was studied for large surface combatants, and some early designs resembled nuclear-powered battleship hybrids. But the Navy ultimately put those reactors into carriers and cruisers instead. That decision came down to return on investment. A nuclear carrier delivered exponentially more striking power per dollar than a nuclear battleship. The Navy was just not going to pay battleship-scale prices for battleship-scale limitations, especially as the Cold War budgets were battlegrounds in and of themselves, since the damn Air Force owned two legs of the nuclear triad and crowded out the other branches. By the 1970s, the US was fully committed to guided missiles. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser and subsequent Arleigh Burke destroyers could fire Tomahawks hundreds of miles with precision. Submarines could strike coastal targets or sink fleets without even being seen. Nothing about those missions required a 70,000-ton armored hull lumbering through the waves. But just like today, the dream didn't die, and there were some genuine attempts to bring battleships back. People sometimes assume battleships died because no one bothered to reinvent them. Actually, the truth is the opposite. Between 1945 and the mid-1990s, the Navy considered multiple modern battleship concepts. All of them failed because they didn't solve real strategic problems. Like we mentioned before, in the 1950s, the Navy examined nuclear-powered battleships equipped with guided missiles. Analysts quickly realized that the missiles worked better on smaller, cheaper hulls that we could build more of. In the late 1960s, the Navy evaluated converting World War II battleships into missile battleships with armored missile cells and heavy anti-air batteries. Once again, the Navy concluded that smaller missile ships were more efficient and survivable when designed from scratch instead of just fixed on a hull from the 1940s. In the mid-1990s, after the USS Missouri was finally retired in 1992, the arsenal ship concept was dreamed up. This was effectively a battleship without guns. Instead, it was to have 512 vertical launching systems, or VLS cells. The Navy and DARPA jointly developed the idea, but Congress eventually defunded it in the fiscal year 1998 budget because they just didn't see the need, since many other vessels and aircraft could accomplish the same thing without creating one very juicy target. The arsenal ship is likely what President Trump has in mind for the Golden Fleet because it's just a massive ship loaded with missiles, but maybe he isn't. I genuinely have no idea what he is thinking. Every time the Navy tried to resurrect battleship-level firepower, submarines, smaller ships, and aircraft came out way ahead. Not because they were cooler, because very few things are cooler than a battleship, but because they delivered more capability per dollar and were far more survivable. But for one brief shining moment, battleships were great again, and no, I am not talking about the 2012 documentary Battleship starring Rihanna, I'm talking about the 1980s. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan pushed for a 600-ship Navy. The Iowa-class ships, Missouri, Iowa, New Jersey, and Wisconsin, were returned to service with new electronics, Harpoon missiles, Tomahawk launchers, phalanx guns, and updated sensors. This sounds like a revival of the battleship, but it was not. The reactivations were mostly political. The Navy got a massive funding boost because Congress loved the idea of big gun diplomacy. And battleships had those big guns, which were really great for naval gunfire support during amphibious operations. But the Navy's reactivation reports make clear that these ships were manpower heavy, maintenance intensive, and offered limited capability compared to modern missile platforms. Battleships weren't really reactivated to dominate the seas, they were reactivated because a Cold War political moment made it possible. If you studied 80s pop culture at all, because that's a very normal thing to do and don't make fun of me for doing it, big was in. Big muscles, big hair, big guns. It was just a resurgence of a brand of American patriotism after the dark days of Vietnam, and our military started to reflect that. That brings us to the Gulf War in 1991, where the battleships fired their last rounds in anger. Iowa-class ships, USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri, let loose hundreds of 16-inch shells and Tomahawk missiles in support of coalition forces. They were useful, but they were not indispensable. Rand's post-war analysis of naval operations concluded that guided missiles delivered far more operational impact than naval gunnery. So once the Soviet Union collapsed, the battleships were retired again, but this time for good. Now let's twist the dagger and talk about why they're not likely to return except for in your dreams. I was going to make fun of people who dream about battleships, but if you dream about battleships, then you belong here, so welcome. If you strip away nostalgia and hero worship, the Navy's decision comes down to 3 problems. First, battleships and just extremely large ships in general are absurdly expensive. It's not just the steel, it's the armor fabrication, the specialized dry docks, the training pipelines, the spare parts, and the escorts required to keep them alive. Modern estimates for building a new battleship vary widely, but if we look at the inflation-adjusted cost of an Iowa class at $2 billion using 1940s tech, we can somewhat safely assume a modern battleship could climb up to $20 billion. Second, they require enormous crews, at least if we are talking about battleships in the classic sense. An Iowa-class battleship took nearly 1,800 sailors to operate. For comparison, a modern Arleigh Burke operates with roughly 300. To be fair, the Arsenal ships of the mid-1990s would have allegedly been fine with crews of 50, but let's be serious about Navy expectations and then reality. Third, they are vulnerable. A battleship is a giant radar target. Modern anti-ship weapons like the Chinese YJ-21 or Russian Kinzhal move too fast and maneuver too aggressively for battleship armor to matter. Even subsonic threats from cruise missiles aren't great news for a giant target. And let's just be brutally honest here, the US can barely build the smaller ships that we so desperately need right now. The Constellation-class frigate was just canceled, the LCS was a disaster, shipyards are struggling to keep up, dry dock space is running out, and we just don't currently have the capacity to build a giant 80,000-ton battleship. If we did, it would come at the cost of smaller vessels, and these days quantity matters quite a bit. Every modern US naval concept points to the same direction. Distributed maritime operations, long-range precision strikes, stealth, uncrewed systems, rapid kill chains. None of this favors a giant, heavily armored ship. Shore bombardment, the last job that battleships were truly good at, has been replaced by cruise missiles, loitering munitions, and precision air power. A single B-52 carrying AGM-158 JASSM missiles can destroy hardened targets from over 600 miles away. Hell, even a C-130 carrying 12 to 15 cruise missiles on a Rapid Dragon pallet would be more effective. A battleship firing 16-inch shells from 24 miles away just simply can't compete. Plus, the Navy wants more submarines, more uncrewed vessels, better sensors, and more survivability through dispersion. A battleship just concentrates too much combat power into a single targetable platform. But who knows? I mean, I'm just a guy who reads words into a camera, so maybe somehow we could figure out how a giant battleship loaded with missiles could work, how we could build it, and how we could keep it safe from rapidly expanding threats. But first, we should probably figure out how to build ships half that size in less than 5 years. Now go ahead and leave us a comment saying that I'm very mean for crushing your battleship dreams, but you know, we gotta confront reality at some point here. So if you think battleships could work, by all means, make your argument in there. You might change my mind. This is just what I figured out. So leave your comments, let us know what you think, like, subscribe, you know, do all those things that I don't really ask you to do and probably should. I wrote the script and Savvy edited the video, and now it's channel update time, where in the past couple videos, I feel like I'm repeating it, but I know not everybody watches everything. I've left my email as kyle.gunn@taskandpurpose.com. I've gotten a lot of people reaching out. I'm still working through them all, but if you find yourself over the holidays, you just need someone to talk to, you're stuck in the barracks, you're stuck at home, you're just not having a good time, go ahead and shoot me an email. Also, you got any criticism, feedback, ideas? One guy asked some questions about the XM30 and that was pretty cool. Go ahead and leave that there. Other than that, I'm wearing a Claymore patent shirt. You can buy it at store.taskandpurpose.com. That you can get for 20% off along with all of our other stuff there with code BLOCKLEAVE. I'm going to leave that code running through the end of the year. If you're watching this in 2026, you can use code ACTUALLYWATCH to get 10% off. Other than that, I don't have much else. I'm just really happy you're all here today, so I'm going to stop and go do other stuff. But I'm Kyle, your friendly ginger producer man. You are all dismissed, and I will see you next time.